guys, I'm Marina with Artworthy Life, and I am so excited to be creating with you today. I teach women how to bring life and art back into their day, and I'm going to do just that in a few minutes while I show you 3 really sweet doodles that you can do in under 30 minutes and add them to your Christmas cards, your Christmas albums, and some other projects that I'll talk about later on. We'll be painting a little Christmas cardinal, a red one, and a little Christmas tree with a lot of little red ornaments, and a red barn. They'll all coordinate, and it's going to be really fun to paint these together. I want to mention before we get to that though, that I actually have much more where this came from. These are only 3 out of 25 doodles that I've been doing throughout the month of November over on my page, Artworthy Life. So make sure you go over there on Facebook, like and follow, and you'll have access to all of the doodles that we've been using to create a 25-day Advent calendar in preparation for the Christmas season. So if you want more where this came from, be sure to go over to Artworthy Life and stay tuned because I'm going to show you these really sweet doodles and I hope you really enjoy them. First, I want to tell you what supplies we'll be using today. The first thing you want to have is a pencil. And then you also want to have your paintbrushes with you. Now you can use any small paintbrushes you'd like. These are just the ones I have on hand. This is by Master's Touch. These two are size 8 and size 2 watercolor brushes. This one's also called a liner brush, just for detail. And this is just another smaller liner brush by Liquitex. It's just labeled liner and it's a super small tip brush. But those are just some options, and any brush you have that's small will work really well. The next thing you want to make sure you have are the tracers that I provided. You can find these on my page at Artworthy Life on Facebook, and I'll also try to provide the link here as well. But we'll be doing these 3 today, so make sure you have those tracers available and cut out. And then you want to have some carbon paper or graphite paper. Graphite paper is the one that's able to be erased, and you just want to have a sheet of that available. Also make sure you have a micron pen. We may use that for some detail. If you don't have a micron pen, any pen will work. There's also something called a Sharpie pen that is more of like an artist pen. That'll work well. Any fine tip black pen is great if you happen to use it. Otherwise, you're more than welcome just to use the detail brush for some of those things. Then you want to have some watercolor paper. Now I've already cut this down to size. These are 2.5 inches by 2.5 inches square. So you'll want 3 of those so that we can paint our paintings. And also something to mix your paint on. Now this is just a plastic throwaway plate, but if you have a palette, go ahead and use that, but you certainly don't need a palette. I also have a paper cutter here. Obviously I've already cut my paper, but if you haven't, make sure you get one of those out so you can cut your edges nice and straight. The last thing I want to show you is the paint set that I'm going to use today. This is a watercolor set by Kuretake. You can pronounce it Kuretake or whatever, but this is a watercolor paint set that I picked up at Hobby Lobby. You do not have to use this set in particular. I really like it, but any watercolor set you have will work really well. So just make sure you have that available. If you don't have watercolors, you're more than welcome to use chalk pastels or colored pencils or anything that you have that you can just color in our tracers with. That'll work just fine as well. But I just wanted to show you the ones that I'm going to use. And make sure that you do have a jar of water and a towel with you, and that will be all you need to start off with. If there's any other supplies that you might need, I'll make sure I mention those as we go. So the first thing you want to do with this project is get your tracers out so they're ready, and also your little pieces of watercolor paper cut to size. And grab your graphite paper, and we're going to go ahead and transfer these images onto the watercolor paper so we have something to go by. I always like to have some kind of a tracer available just to make it easy, because your painting should be fun, not stressful. We're making fun art, not fine art, and a tracer really helps. So I'm going to lay this black graphite paper down onto the watercolor paper. Now this is a one-sided graphite paper, so only one side has the ink on it. And the way you know that it's the correct side down is to just rub your finger on it, and if it comes off with some black ink, that's the correct side to be face down onto the watercolor paper. So I'm just going to lay that down and then put my tracer right on top of that and just try to center it up on my little watercolor paper so that I can have my image centered on the page. Now I just have a mechanical pencil. Any fine tip pen or pencil will work great. And I'm just going to outline all the lines that I want to be able to see when I go to paint this in. So I'm just tracing all the little lines on my tracer. And I'm going to go around all the edges, make sure I get every little line, and that'll give me a nice guide to follow as I do my painting. Now you don't want to press down too hard because you don't want your lines to be very, very dark when you lift up your page. Just make sure you give it a good enough pressure that it's coming off onto the next page, but not too much. You don't want your lines too dark. Okay, and now we'll just lift up this and make sure that it did transfer. And it looks like it did. So now I can move my tracer and we'll move on to these other ones as well. So now we have our 3 tracers available. The next step, I'm going to use a supply that you don't have to actually use, but I want to introduce it to you because sometimes it can save you a little bit of hassle on the front end, and that is called masking fluid. This particular brand is Fine Line Masking Fluid. It comes with a nice fine tip that you can squeeze the liquid through, but basically this acts like masking tape. You paint it on ahead of time and then you let it dry, and then afterwards, once it's dry, you can paint directly over it just as if you were using masking tape, and then when you pull it off, it leaves the under paper, whether it is blank watercolor paper or a previous coat of watercolor paint, it just leaves that. So it basically is like masking tape, but you can paint it on in whatever shape you want, and I just think it would be fun to use it on this project. So instead of actually using the little tip that comes with it, I'm going to just paint it on with our paintbrush. So first I want to paint it onto our snow of our barn. So I'm just going to open the lid just like that and take a little bit of the, it's kind of a glue texture, so I'm going to take a little bit of the masking fluid and just paint it on to where the snow is on the roof of this barn. So I'm going to be pretty generous with my masking fluid. I don't want to paint it too thin and let the paint seep through. So I'm just going to be pretty generous with it and put it on all of the snow that is on this little barn here. And that way, once we paint the barn and we paint the sky, it will leave a nice white space where the snow is. Now, alternatively, you can go back with white paint and just paint in the snowy areas, and that would work just fine as well. But I did want to try with the masking fluid and go ahead and give that a shot. The next thing I want to do is actually use the other side of my brush, the other end, just the tip here, and we're going to do some little polka dots on this Christmas tree so that there will be ornaments on the tree that won't get painted in while we're painting the other layers. So I'm just going to dip this directly into the masking fluid and do some polka dots all over the tree, just in lots of different areas, and I also want them of varying sizes. So I'm just going to get a whole bunch of paint and just polka dot my tree all the way down and just stay on that tree shape and stagger my little polka dots. Okay, I think that looks pretty good. Now I'm just going to clean my brush off and make sure absolutely that you clean your brush. You You want to clean the bristles of any brush that you used with masking fluid, and be sure not to use your absolute favorite brush if you're worried that you might not clean it right away, because masking fluid is very much like tape or glue, and it can ruin a brush if you're not careful. So do clean your brushes right away. Make sure they don't get ruined by your masking fluid. Now I'm actually going to take a hair dryer and blow dry this for a little while, just to make sure the masking fluid gets nice and dry, and also to speed up the process of drying so I don't have to wait so long. So when you finish blow drying or using a heat gun or anything that you want to use to dry this off, your masking fluid will be kind of rubbery to the touch. So you just want to make sure that you don't have any masking fluid that is liquid anymore. And that's all you need to do. I'm actually going to set these aside and make sure they cool off and dry off totally and completely. So while those are waiting, we're going to work on the cardinal. So now just go ahead and get your cardinal, and I'm going to show you how to paint these all up really nicely so you can use them for your projects. So for this one, just make sure you have your water nearby and your watercolor paints. And I'm just going to start with a red, and also make sure you have your palette nearby. So I'm just going to start with a red here. And I want my cardinal to be nice and bright, but I also want him to coordinate with the red that I'm going to use on the barn and the tree. So I'm going to use a combination of a true red and a red that has a little bit more orange in it. But really, any red you have will work great. And we're going to start off on his little body. I'm going to use quite a bit of water and then just paint into his body like this. We're just going to paint it in like a coloring page. Pull that color all the way down to his little wing there. And then I'm going to work somewhat quickly because I don't want the watercolor to dry while I'm still working. So I'm going to work a little bit quickly on his little body and fill that in. Now I am coloring this in like a coloring page, but if my edges aren't perfect, I don't really mind because I'm going to give him some texture too later on. So now I'm going to add just a little bit of water. So I've wet my paintbrush and I'm just wetting the page I'm working on a little bit, and I'm going to add a tiny bit of yellow to the breast area because I want him to brighten up just a little bit and have some other colors going on. And now I'm just going to go down to the tail and fill that in as well, keeping it really wet. Just keep that really wet, and now I'm going to add a little bit of that same yellow to the edge of the tail. And this is working wet on wet. Got a little bit of a speck of dust on my page, so I'm going to get that off real quick. And you know, sometimes you just got to work with stuff like that. Okay, got the dust off, so I'm going to fill this in. Clean my brush off, make sure I have just red going on. Paint that in where his tail is. And then also just put that yellow back in on top. This is a very simplified painting, so please feel free to de-stress and just color it in. So we're going to color in his little wing. So first I'm just wetting his wing just a little bit, and I'm going to add a little bit more red to the wing. And then I'm going to go up under his wing here, just adding some true red back in where we've already been. And my painting is still somewhat wet, so this is wet on wet. When you paint wet on wet, you're able to add pigment back in where you already were, and it blends itself in. So I'm just basically touching the areas that are still wet with more pigment, and it's filling those areas in to be a little bit deeper. Now I'm going to grab a little bit darker red. That's this one over here. It's more of a burgundy, a darker maroon color. I'm using my size 8 round right now, and I'm just going to color up underneath the wing right here. And then I'm going to do a little bit down here for some shading, just anywhere where I think it might need to be a little darker. I think I'm going to make it a little dark down here by his legs, and then bring that up into his belly. And you'll see that starting to bleed out into the rest of the painting where it's still wet. I'm going to take my wet brush and just help that out a little by touching it. Help it blend in a little bit. Okay, I'm going to let that rest for just a little bit, and now I'm going to switch to the branch. So I'm going to grab my size 6, sorry, this is a size 2 round. This is my liner brush actually. So I'm just going to make sure that I get that nice and wet, and grab a little bit of brown. And to make the brown I want to use, I'm going to use this mustard color as well as this more tan brown color. Kind of mix those two together. Then I'm going to add a lot of water to lighten it up. Now, if you have a scrap paper nearby, I would highly encourage you to have scrap paper nearby. Go ahead and test your colors out before you use them. I just have this little tiny piece. And I like to do that because that is less pressure than just painting it directly onto the watercolor page. A lot of times it looks a little different on your palette than it will on your page. So I'm just going to color in the branch, and I'm using small brush strokes, really quick brush strokes, and leaving some white space. So basically, as I'm painting, if there's an area that didn't get colored in all the way, I'm not going to worry about it, because that white space allows your painting to breathe just a little bit. So I'm going to do that, and then I want to come and grab some black, just a tiny bit of black, mix that into my tan. And with that, I'm going to just paint the underside of the branch to create a little bit of shadow on my tree. And on the underside of this little branch and the underside of this one, just on the bottom edge of all the little branches. And now I'm going to get a little bit more black. I'm working with a fairly dry brush at this point. So I'm getting a little bit more black and mixing it with the brown. And then I'm just going to go along the edges of that branch where we've already painted while it's still wet, and just add a little bit of black. That'll make our branch have a little bit more texture to it. And now I'm going to water my brush down and just bring the rest of that black all the way up the branch. So just adding layers of texture and color as we go. It's going to help that branch look a little bit more real, like that. Now our bird is starting to dry, so I do want to come back in, start working on him. And I'm going to come back to this puddle of red that we were using earlier. What I want to do now is start adding some of the darker areas into the bird. So first I'm going to add a little bit of black to this red that we have until I create like a deep burgundy. Now you'll notice I'm not going over here and grabbing the burgundy, I'm actually just creating my own, and that's because I want the tone to just gradually shift into that darker color. And I'm just making my own color rather than just pulling it from the palette, so that I know it's all going to blend. And I'm going to use this dark reddish brown black color and fill in around his face. So we know that cardinals have that nice square, black square around their face. And I'm going to probably come back in with black and paint that in, but I do want to go ahead and do one layer of this lighter color to create some dimension before I go back in. So just follow your tracer, the line that I've drawn, and color that in with some dark brownish red. So next I want to paint the underside of this wing just to make that more defined. I'm also going to paint the underside of the tail just a tiny bit, and the edge of the tail, anywhere I feel like needs just a little bit more definition, I'm going to use this darker color. Come up under that wing too. I'm going to wet my brush just a little bit. If my brush is too dry, I can't create a very thin line, so I'm going to make sure my brush is nice and wet. And then I'm going to come up under the tail, down here by the legs, where there's the greatest shadow, and just put in a little bit more dark lines in there. All right, there's our little cardinals so far. I'm gonna let that dry. And while that's drying, we're gonna come in and do our little leaves. So these leaves are whatever kind of leaf you want to imagine them to be. They're not, I'm not particular about my leaves having to be perfect, but they are going to have holly berries near them, so I'm not going to make them a perfectly smooth, round leaf. I'll just hint that they might be holly leaves, but maybe not. So what I'm doing is I'm grabbing a little bit of my lighter green and mixing in some darker green, and what I'm aiming for is just kind of an evergreen color, but I want it to not be super, super bright, a little bit more dull of a color. So I'm just playing around with the colors that I have available. I might add a little bit of brown to it. That'll kind of muddy up the color a little and get me to what I'm going for. And then I'm going to use a combination of that and an emerald green. So now I'll clean my brush and I'll grab just some of this emerald color and a darker green, which I'm going to use to create kind of a true evergreen color, which I really like to use. So kind of just a bluish green, a darker evergreen color. I'm going to add a little bit of black to that to deepen it. And also that lighter green. I'm going to use those in combination. So now I'm gonna, and you know, you don't have to use the colors I'm using. I just like them. If you want to just use straight green right out of the palette, go for it. It'll look great. So I'm gonna use that darker green, and all I'm gonna do, and feel free to turn your page in the way that best suits your hand. That's gonna make your paintings a lot easier. So I'm actually gonna start with this first leaf. So basically I have the leaf pointed towards me. Its furthest tip is pointed towards me. I'm just going to use the shape of my paintbrush to make the shape of the leaf by pulling the little edges toward me and kind of feathering them out like that. The next leaf I want to be the other green, mostly the other green. So I'm going to do the same thing, pull those leaves toward me and be okay if there's a little white space left behind. In fact, I kind of intentionally put some white space there because I like it. I think I want to have a leaf here, even though I didn't draw one in, so I'm going to go ahead and do one here too. So you can see I'm just pulling towards me and pulling my brush towards me and making that fuzzy little kind of evergreen looking leaf. Now while that's wet, I'm going to touch my darker evergreen color and just touch the one side of the leaf so it kind of fades from a darker evergreen into the other color. Now I'm going to wash my brush so I can come back with my dark evergreen color on this leaf. And I know I have holly berries there, so I'm going to dodge those. Pull this towards me. And there's my little green leaf. And now I'm going to use a lighter green here. Pull that like that. And then do the last one just the same. Just pulling those leaves toward me, and see how that creates a fun little evergreen looking leaf. You can just imagine whatever it is. And the last thing we want to do is paint in the little berries, and then we'll go back to our beautiful little cardinal. So I'm going to grab some of this true red, mix it in with the red I've already got. Maybe just a little bit of these darker reds. I'm just going for like a cherry red color. And now I'm just going to draw a little circle. And so I'm just swirling around and around and around with my brush and leaving a little tiny white dot on the left-hand side. So swirling around and leaving a little white dot for shine on the berry. And that I'm going to do for all of them. And as you paint in your berries, you could vary the color. As you do these little holly berries, you could do a slightly more orange, red,
And then a slightly darker red, I can pick up a little bit of this darker red and paint in the next one with that. And by varying those colors, you create shadows in your painting, and you also somewhat make it look like a few of them are maybe riper than others, which is also kind of cool. And then I have the little berries over here. I'm going to pick up more bright red again. And I've switched to my liner brush, so make sure you're using a slightly smaller brush for this. If you wanted to, you could use a red micron pen with a fine tip, and that would work really well as well. Really well as well. I don't always have my words all together, so sometimes I just have to make fun of myself. Okay, one last little berry. And that finishes our little branch. And now we're going to paint in his little eye. Now you can use a micron pen for this as well. It will not make that big of a difference, but I'm going to go ahead and use my small detail brush. This is my smallest liner brush, and I'm going to pick up some of this black paint. I'm going to get my brush nice and wet with water so that my lines can be nice and smooth. So I'm just getting a lot of black paint on my tiny little brush, and I'm just going to paint in his eye. It's exactly like doing the little holly berry. I'm just going to do a little tiny swirl of a circle and leave a shiny spot on the left. And that will create his little eye. Less is more. Once you think his eye looks good, just stop painting, and that way you don't overdo it and make him look like he isn't looking anywhere. That little shiny spot makes him look like he's looking off into the distance. Just like that. So there's his little eye, and now I'm just going to take the black and go ahead and go up under here, under his wing. It's just a little bit more shadow so that his eye doesn't look too dark against everything else. Just touching it, just barely. I don't want too much black. Just here and there, and I'm also going to come up under this branch again. Give us one more layer of shadow just on the very edge of that branch. There we go. Now I do want to paint in his little beak. So to do that, I'm going to clean my brush off first, and I'm going to grab a little bit of yellow and add it into the red, because the cardinal's beaks are kind of an orange color. So I'm going to create a nice little orange color. Make sure I've gotten all the black out of my paintbrush first. And then grab some yellow and a little bit of the red to create that little orange color. I don't want it too orange, just kind of a reddish color, reddish orange color. And then we're going to come in and do his beak, just fill it in like a coloring page and leave a tiny bit of white space so his beak shines. And what I always like to say is that when you have a tiny little brush, a lot of times people get kind of intimidated. They think, oh, a tiny little brush is scary, it means detail and it's scary. But think about it like this. This is what I always say. A tiny little brush is like the difference between using an unsharpened pencil and a sharpened pencil. Which one is easier to work with? So it's not that it's so difficult to use, it's just that it gives you a nice fine tip to work with. I'm going to use this same orange to do his little legs. And he's kind of holding on to the other side of the branch, so I'm going to put some little toes down here just to show he's holding on. And then I'm going to come back with my black. I've actually noticed there's a little red spot that needs to be filled in right next to his eye, so I'm going to fill that in real quick. There we go. And I'm going to come in with black, same as we were before, with the smallest brush, and fill in his face, because we know the cardinals have that nice black shape around their little beak. And I'm just going to slowly do some brush strokes pulling away from the beak with that black. And that'll frame his little face. And that's all we need to do for this cardinal. So that one is done and ready to go. And now our other paintings should be ready. So let's start in on this barn first. We'll finish off with the Christmas tree because that one is so fun and so simple you will not even be able to believe it. So first off, what I want to do is give us a little bit of background. Actually, we could do both of these at the same time because we do have layers to do on both of these. So the first thing I want to do is take my liner brush and I'm going to take my dark evergreen color. Now you'll notice on all three of these I'm going to use the same color schemes because I want them to coordinate. So this dark evergreen color, I'm going to lighten it quite a bit, just a real light color. Now I'm going to test that on my little tiny scrap paper over here. And then I'm going to use my reference pages. So I have my tracers here and here. I'm just going to use that as a reference page, and this smallest tree I'm going to paint in with a very, very light green. So it's just some strokes going left and then kind of down the middle and to the right, and left and down the middle and to the right, left and to the middle and down the right, and that's all we're going to do, just a really light tree. And then I'm going to switch to this one, and we'll do the exact same thing with a very light green, very light evergreen color. We're going to do a tiny little brush up here, a little tree up here in the corner, maybe just slightly darker than that, and it's to the left and across, to the left and across again. I'm going to pick up a little bit more paint, come down like that, and there's going to be our first tree. And the next one is going to be down here. I want it to be a little shorter so they're not perfectly symmetrical in the background there. And I'm just using these as a reference. If you can see those, this reference page. Just using these two as a reference. So I'm going to paint in that tree in the background. Left and across the middle, down like that to fill those all in. So those are going to dry, and as they dry, we will add some layers to them. Just like that. Okay, and now I'm going to switch to this barn. Now as we do the barn, you'll notice what we had earlier was this masking fluid. So that is going to really help us as we paint this in, because we won't have to dodge that because it's already painted in. So the first thing I want to do is paint in the red of the barn. So I'm going to grab my slightly larger brush, my size 8 round, and the red that I was working with before. This one's kind of dark, so I'm going to leave that. Just create another little puddle of red over here. So it's the same red I was using for the cardinal, a true red with a touch of orange in it. And I'm just going to activate my watercolors by adding water to them, and then bringing them over to my palette and adding just a little bit more water, making sure my brush is nice and wet. And then I'm going to paint in the barn with a really gorgeous bright red. So as I paint in the barn, I'm not worried about the barn being perfectly colored in. So if I have a few streaks of white like that, I'm just going to leave them because I like that look of it being a little bit sketchy, just like a sketch that you have drawn by hand isn't fully colored in all the time, and I like that look. So I'm just going to let that happen and color this in with my brush as I go. And as I'm painting, this snow that's on the top of the door and the window is already painted in with our masking fluid, so I don't even have to dodge that. And then I'm going to just pull this down into the other side of the barn and just kind of go up and down with my brush and let those little white spaces create themselves. It's going to make the barn look a little bit rustic and pretty. Okay, so that's all we really need to do to the barn right now. Next I'm going to paint in our little fence up here in the front. So with my same brush, I'm going to grab a little bit of brown. We have a little bit of our brown still over here. We might need to make some more. So I'm going to grab a little bit of tan and some of that black that we have over here. Make that kind of muddy brown color and paint in our fence. So I'm going to paint in the lower half of the fence first and leave a little bit of light space on the top. So just the lower half of the railings is what I'm painting in mostly right now. That's just to make the fence kind of look like it's a little bit shiny. Not really shiny, but just like the sun is hitting it. And then I'm going to fill in the top of the fence with a darker brown. The little top of the poles. And grab a slightly darker brown and go ahead and do the bottom half of the posts again. This, if you can tell, I'm going very fast and I'm not being too concerned about it being perfect. The idea is that this is really just kind of relaxed and it'll turn out beautifully and you don't really have to be too stressed about it, so that's really nice. Now what I'm going to do is take my brush, my smaller liner brush, and paint in the snow. So just some little detail on the snow. So I'm going to use a very light tan color, just the same tan that we've been using, water it down quite a bit, and come across the bottom of the barn here, and just a little bit on the outside edge here or down here by the fence, and then do a little bit of lines out here in the front. And that'll just make the snow not look so flat. Next I want to paint in the barn, doors, and the window. I'm going to use the same dark brown, add a slightly darker brown. We have kind of a chocolatey color over here, and maybe a tiny little bit of black. So just you're working with it until you get like a muddy brown color. Just play with it and feel free to test it on your scrap paper. It's probably a little brighter than I want it. And then I'm going to water it down so it's not too dark. So add a little bit of water to my watercolor palette. And then come over here and paint in all the little X's around my barn. Now the one thing I did make sure of is that I waited until the red was drying, because I don't want the brown to accidentally mix with the red. And watercolors, as long as they're still wet, they will run into each other, into the puddles, if the puddles are next to each other, if you're not careful. So I just wanted to make sure that that was already dry. And since it is, I can come back in here and paint in the little X's, like that. And again, I am not taking extra super care with this. You can just paint these in really fast, and it's such a tiny little sketch that it doesn't matter if it's perfect, and it actually looks kind of sweet and pretty and charming if you don't perfectly paint it in. The next thing I want to paint is the roof. So that same brown, we're going to paint in this roof. Whoops, I got a little blob. If you get a little blob, dry your brush off and soak it up like a sponge. I love to do that while I'm filming because it allows me to show you guys how to come back in and fix your work. So since that's wet, I'm going to wait for that to dry before I paint that side. I'm going to paint this side first with my brown. Paint in my roof. Like that. I want that brown to be just a little bit darker. It's a little bit too light for me. I'm going to grab some brown and black and mix it together, make sure that comes in nice and dark. And remember, we're going to pull off our masking fluid later, so we don't have to worry about the snow not showing up. We can just paint right over the masking fluid. And there's our little roof. So I'm going to let that dry for a little while. And next I want to paint in my trees. So this is the second layer of trees, and we're actually going to do both of these at the same time. So going back to my evergreen color, I'm going to pick up some of that. And I'm going to make sure it is a slightly darker green than I used on the previous layer. So just making sure that's nice and dark. I'm adding just a little bit back to my palette because I'm running out of paint over here, and I'm going to add a touch of black. Make sure that's nice and wet. So just play with your color until it's nice and wet. You got a lot of color on your palette and plenty on your paintbrush for sure. Okay, so that looks really good. Nice bluish green evergreen color. And now we can come in and paint our next tree. So just using your reference pages as a guide, I'm going to paint this one in first. And this is just to the left and a few strokes to the right. A few strokes to the left, across the middle and to the right. Across the middle and to the right, like that. I'm just going to dodge that fence. Now, if you really wanted to save yourself a little bit of trouble and you have a little extra time, you can definitely paint in the fence with masking fluid and then wait for it to dry and paint in the rest. So just paint in the fence with masking fluid, let that dry, paint in your trees, and then you can pull off the masking fluid and paint in your fence last. And that would keep me from having to dodge the fence over here. But it's not too bad because it's not too much behind the fence. So there's our second tree. I'm going to paint these in. Same thing, I'm going to come over here and just do some strokes to the left and kind of flick my brush across as I go, like that. I want to use quite a bit of paint on the page so that my brush is nice and wet and my trees are nice and full and fluffy. Add a little bit more water to my palette there. You can see you could just make your tree as skinny or as wide as you want. And it doesn't have to be perfect. These are very forgiving trees. And you'll notice we're just painting right over where the big tree is because it's going to come in even darker, and so it won't matter. It will still show up. We'll use a slightly darker green on that one. So now I'm painting the other Christmas tree shape over here, just all the way across like that. Paint those in, left to right. Make them nice and fluffy. Like that. And the shape of your liner brush really helps. You almost don't even have to work for it, it just creates itself. Okay, we're gonna let that dry. Come back to our little barn painting. And next on the barn, I just want to fill in the door and the window with a light brown. So using my same little liner brush, I'm going to take a light brown, fill the door in, just really quickly paint in all those little triangles like that. And just fill them in really quickly. Next I want to come in with some black because we're wanting to bring some depth to the painting. So the next thing I want to do is just grab straight black, a little bit on my brush, make sure I don't have my brush too dry. And I'm going to come up on the edges of this door and along the bottom of the door and just paint in some little black lines that are going to make the barn kind of pop. It's going to make the colors pop and the barn look a little bit more defined so you can see all the little edges. And this is where that masking fluid really comes in handy, because we don't have to dodge it with this harsh black that could be really scary to use right next to white. And you definitely want to come up along the edge of the snow with the black, because it will make that snow really pop if you run it along the edge of it. I'm going along almost all of these edges. I'm going to come along the bottom of the barn as well with this black, and just make all the little edges pop. Up along the bottom of the roof for sure, and of course underneath the snow where the shadow would be. Come up along the bottom of that roof and the snow there as well. Okay, now I'm going to water down my brush just a little bit. Still working with kind of a brownish black, and I'm going to come back in and do some slats on the barn. Basically the wood panels that make up the barn, and that's just some stripes straight down, not perfect, just random, going straight down the barn to make it look like it's built with panels of wood like that. I'm going to put a little shadow down here at the bottom. Just fill in that color really quickly. And that's our little barn. I might add just a little bit of dark brown. Let's see. We add a little bit of dark brown to the fence. That'll make sure the barn doesn't look too dark against that beautiful little fence up front. So I'm going to add a slightly darker brown. A lot of times when you're painting, you need to step back, look at it all together, and then say, do I need to add anything to make it look more put together? And this fence was starting to kind of disappear against the snow, so I want to make sure it stands out and looks good next to that barn. So I'm just using some darker black along the edge of that fence, kind of on the same areas we put the brown, just along the edges like that. Like that. So there's our little fence. Feel free to add more detail wherever you need to, but just, you know, take a look and see, do I like how this is looking? And your eye will be able to gravitate toward what needs a little bit more and what's looking good already. Alright, so there's our little barn. I'm going to let that dry before we pull off the masking fluid because I don't want to smear any of the color we already have. And now let's switch to this Christmas tree. So the last thing we need to do on this painting is some dark green. We're going to use some evergreen again. And I'm just going to add another little bit of black to it because I want a real deep, rich evergreen color. So I'm going to add that green, make sure my green is still nice and rich in color. So I'm adding some dark green here, and then some dark black again until that gets a nice rich color. Just kind of play with it until you feel like, yeah, that looks like a Christmas tree. But I do want more, it's surprising, you want a little bit more black than you would think because we want all of our ornaments and everything to pop against the tree. So obviously you don't want to paint a black tree, but make sure you have quite a bit of black in there. That'll make your tree really pop. So now the same shape we were using before, we're just going to bring those little branches down the tree like that. I'm going to go all the way down. And as we go across the ornaments, I'm going to really make sure that those ornaments do actually get totally colored around because I want to make sure they show up. So I'm going to come down and do these little branches, but then I'll go back and make sure all those ornaments are really showing up on this tree. So we're just going left to right again with our strokes and then going all the way across. And really just let the brush do the work. So see how much darker that green is than the lighter green trees in the background, and it just looks great. It looks stunning against the background. We're going to fill in all of those like that, all the way across our Christmas tree, and leave some white space in between the little flicks of paint. You do want your tree to breathe just a little bit, so make sure you're not just coloring in a big triangle of green. Make sure you are actually leaving a little bit of white space here and there. This tree is nice and wide at the bottom, so I'm going to make sure it looks nice and fluffy down there. And then come all the way across with my brush strokes. Oops, all the way like that. And I'm pushing down quite a bit with the belly of my brush. In other words, I'm not painting like this. I'm painting like this quite a bit. So pushing down quite a bit with the belly of my brush. So now, as I said before, I'm going to come back in and just fill in some green where I know there's an ornament, because I want that ornament to look nice and round. So I'm going to make sure there's not too much white space around the ornaments themselves. So we have a nice round ornament when we pull off our masking fluid. So I'm just kind of finding all my little dots of masking fluid and painting around those. I don't want to make it too obvious, but I'm just making sure they're totally painted around so they look nice and round. You can just do that real quickly, just looking at all of my little ornaments and making sure they look like they're painted around. And that should do it. I have one out here hanging out, so I'm just going to give him a little tree limb to sit on. Make sure he has a place to sit. Okay. And just take a look at your tree, make sure it looks like it's even and filled in, and I think that looks really good. So now I'm just going to take our blow dryer and blow dry this really quickly so that it dries a little bit faster, so we can get started on the ornaments. Okay, so that should do it. It's nice and dry now. Now all we're going to do is pick off the masking fluid. I'm going to start with this barn first because I know it's already dry, and that'll give that a chance to cool down just a little bit. But all we need to do is just pick this off with our fingers. They make erasers that are made for this masking fluid, but you can definitely just do it with your fingers if you want to. Just gently scrape it off and let it kind of roll off of the page. Like that. And that leaves some really sweet little snow on our barn and makes that really, really stand out nice and white and crisp. And on this one, we're going to do the same thing. Just kind of gently scratch those little dots of ornaments off like that. Be very careful that you don't tear your paper. If you hear it start to tear, just pull it from a different direction, and that will save your painting from getting torn. Every once in a while, the masking fluid is very, very well stuck down, and so it will tear if you're not careful. Let me just grab our other little cardinal so we can look at that while we're doing these ornaments. So like I said, I want our colors to be nice and cohesive, so I want to be able to see the cardinal and the red barn while we paint in the ornaments so that the ornaments match those really well. Before we do that though, I'm going to paint in a little star on the top, and to do that star I'm going to use this same orange that I used for the cardinal's beak. And this is just a subtle way of making sure all the colors I use in all the paintings are really cohesive. So I'm just going to paint this little 6-pointed star in by doing a line straight up and down, and then basically an X over top of that. That makes a nice little star on top of our tree, a very sweet little star. I'm going to wash my brush, and now we'll paint in with my liner brush all of the little ornaments. I'm going to use the same red that I used for the cardinal and for the barn, and I'm just going to start filling those in. So I already have a puddle of red here. I'm going to use that to fill in the ornaments. And it's just the same way we did the holly berries, a circle like this, and then we'll leave a white space on the left-hand side for the shine on the ornament. And the ornaments by no means have to be perfectly round. They don't need to be perfectly colored in. Thankfully, because all those little dots are there, we just have to follow the guide of those little circles and they will turn out wonderfully. So just fill those in and give them a nice little shine on the left-hand side. You're going to use a nice vibrant red, just like we did on the barn. I'm going to fill in all of those. And what I'm going to do after I get some of these painted in is switch to a lighter red, and that way they're all going to be the same type of color. They're going to be a type of red, but your eye will be much more pleased if they're not all exactly the same red. It'll make it look a little more real and just make the painting look a lot sweeter in the end. So just dodge a few of them, paint in most of them with this bright red that we're using. Then we'll come in with a slightly lighter red in just a minute. So I'm just painting in most of these, and I'm kind of doing every other one. Come over here and paint this one. They kind of look like little cherries. And this is, like I said, exactly the same thing we were doing when we painted in the berries, just that same little shape. And paint this one in with red. And then I'm going to paint in this bottom one down here. Just making sure I have quite a bit that are painted nice and red. Okay. So now I'm just going to lighten my red quite a bit, add a lot of water to my palette until I end up with a slightly pink looking color. I'm just going to test that on my little scrap paper. Yep, that's what I want, a very light red. Super light, it'll be kind of a pearly pink color. I'm just going to paint in the rest of those with that really light red. And that'll just look so nice against all those red ornaments. Just that pinky color with a little bit of shine. And so you can just fill those in. And they'll dry to a nice soft pink color, which will be really pretty. If you have a pink in your palette already, you could use that, but I do like sticking with the same red and just manipulating it so that I know they'll match and I don't end up with like a pink that has more purple in it or more orange or something like that. So it's nice to stick with the same reds that you were already using and just manipulate them with black or water to lighten them up. So just paint in all of those. I'm still leaving the shine on the left-hand side so they start to look like little pearl beads. It's just so pretty. Just like that. And there is our little Christmas tree. Next, I'm going to show you how to take all three of these paintings and make them into beautiful cards that you can use this Christmas, and I'll also tell you some other things you can use them for. These three little doodles are so versatile. There's so many things you could do with them. as you can tell. But the first thing I want to show you is the simplest probably, and that is just to make a little Christmas card. So I'm going to take this little Christmas tree and show you how you can make a very quick Christmas card with it. And you can make Christmas cards out of all of these. So the first thing I'm going to do is just take some brown cardstock. I'm going to measure off how big I need my card to be, how wide I need it to be. So I'm just going to place the card right here, and I can tell I can have a little border like that, and I'm going to mark it. And then I'm just going to cut that down to size. So that's about how wide I need it to be. Next, I'm going to take my little card, put it down here at the bottom, and I'm going to kind of eyeball how big I need it to be in order for this border to go all the way around. So I'm going to take my pencil and mark that I need it about like that. And where that dotted line is, I'm going to take a straight edge, which I'm just going to use the edge of this paper for that. So basically I've decided that in order for it to have a border, that's about where the line needs to be. So I'm going to mark that edge, and I'm going to fold the paper on that edge right there. Just make a quick fold right on that edge I've just found. So that will be the fold of the little card. Just going to press that down. If you have one of these wooden folding tools, you can do that too. And then on this edge right here, I'm going to go ahead and cut. And that gives me the perfect size that I need for my card. Of course, I'm going to go ahead and erase that line that I drew where the edge was, and my markers, my little mark points. And now I have a nice little card that I can just attach this to the front of. So to do that, I'm going to use a double-sided tape. This is kind of an industrial archival quality tape, but you can certainly use any double-sided tape that you have, and you don't need much. So I'm just going to take a couple of pieces of that, turn my page over, put some tape down, like that. I'm just going to put a tiny little piece in each corner, and I have static cling on my tape paper or plastic. Just like that, and then one more piece, and we can go ahead and tape that down onto our card. And there you have it, a very sweet little card. And I love little cards like this at Christmas time. I give them by hand to ladies at the church. I also really like to use them as thank you cards after Christmas for thank you gifts, because they're so small that they just make a great thank you card. You can just say thank you so much for whatever gift they gave me and sign it, and it just makes a sweet, sweet card. It's also really good for party favors or a tag on a gift. You could actually attach this to the top of a gift, and it would make a really great gift tag. Just make sure they know you painted it so they don't toss it, because it's gorgeous. All right, the next thing I want to show you is how you can use these for your dinner table setting. And so what you maybe haven't thought of is that these would make a really great place marker, so like a place card. So all we're going to do is the exact same thing. I'm just going to mark where that was, where that edge is, so I know about how wide this needs to be. And then I'm going to actually make this fold with a little bit of space on the bottom, which means I probably won't need to trim any of it. So I'm just going to fold this in half, like this. Use my folding tool again. You can just use the edge of your thumb or whatever if you don't want to use a tool. And then I'm going to basically center this up on the top, but leave a space on the bottom. So I'm just going to tape this down really fast. And once you have it taped, you can attach it to your card. And you'll just tape that down like that. Try to center it up as best you can. And then you can just use a micron pen and write the name of the person who will be sitting in that place. And another thing is, if you don't want to paint this a bunch of times, why don't you just paint it once, and then you can make copies of it and use it all across your table spread. Or better yet, make 3 of them and have a great time making them, and then just copy those 3, and then if you have 20 or 25 or 30 guests, you never run out of cards because you can just make copies and not feel stressed about painting all of them. And then you'll just write the name of the person who's going to be sitting there. And there you go. And that can be their little place card next to their plate when you go to eat dinner or Christmas dinner. And that makes a really great little touch on your Christmas table spread when you have a nice name place marker. The last thing I want to show you is really simple, but we're going to use cardstock again, and this is actually just a Christmas ornament. And you'd be surprised how sweet a little paper ornament can actually look on the tree. So again, we're going to cut this down to size, but I'm going to actually cut out a full square. So I'm going to mark here and here, and then cut this down square. And once I have my square cut out, I'm going to tape my little painting down with some of my tape. And you can tape it a little better than this. I'm just quickly putting this on so I can show you. So I'm just going to tape that down. And then I have these little clips that I bought in the paper crafting section of Hobby Lobby. They come in a package like this, and this one was only $4, and you could use a 40% off coupon as well, but it's by Tim Holtz Ideology. And all I'm going to do is take some little feathers that I found and washed. These ones are from our guinea fowl in the backyard. And I'm just going to center those up on the corner here, like that. And just use this clip to pinch those on. So I'm going to hold them in place with my thumb and pinch those on with the clip and kind of move them so they don't cover up my little painting. And then I'm going to take a little bit of twine and just loop it through this little clip. It has a nice little hole at the top that you can use. And just string that through your little clip at the top. Once you have it strung through, I like to do an overhand knot to create a loop. And then once you have the overhand knot, you can tighten it down. And I'm going to move that little loop down to the front of my clip and make a little bow there. And you can tie a little bow with another ribbon if you wanted to, and you could add anything that can fit under that little clip. But that creates a nice little bow on the front of the clip, and you can hang that ornament from your Christmas tree. Also, you can put a dot of hot glue there or anything to keep that clip straight, but that just makes a fun little Christmas ornament that will be really unique, especially on a rustic Christmas tree or a traditional Christmas tree. And again, this would also make a really great gift tag. If you want to add that to a package that you already have, it would be really sweet. And remind your friends or whoever you give it to, they can always just take this clip off and they can frame this or put it on something else, and it just makes a fun little versatile doodle that you can use for a lot of different things. So there's our 3 projects and our 3 doodles.
There you have it, 3 really sweet little doodles you can use this Christmas season to make thank you cards, or a little place card for your dinner table at Christmas time, or even a little ornament for your tree. Feel free to use these for whatever you need for personal use this season, and if you do make one of them, I'd love to see your finished work, so please share it and tag me at Artworthy Life. And don't forget to come on over to Artworthy Life, where you have access to all 25 of the doodles we use to create this Advent calendar. You're gonna love all of the inspiration there, and if you want to get more inspiration, catch me live every weekday at 10:30 a.m. Pacific time, where I share a Bible verse and we just get to create together and visit. It's a really fun time. In the meantime, God bless you, and I will see you soon.